for the younger generation is vibrant with a new psychology. The new spirit is awake in the masses. And under the very eyes of the professional observers is transforming what has been a perennial problem into the progressive phases of contemporary Negro life. Could such a metamorphosis have taken place as suddenly as it appeared to? The answer is no. Not because the new Negro is not here, but because the old Negro had long become more of a myth than a man. The old Negro, we must remember, was a creature of moral debate and historical controversy. His has been a stock figure perpetuated as a historical fiction, partly in innocent sentimentalism, partly in deliberate reactionism. The Negro himself has contributed his share to this through a sort of protective social mimicry forced upon him by the adverse circumstances of dependence. So for generations in the mind of America, the Negro has been more of a formula than a human being. As something to be argued about, condemned, or defended, to be kept down, or in his place, or held up, to be worried with or worried over, harassed or patronized, a social bogey or a social burden. These are the words from Alain Locke's New Negro, which was published in 1925. And this particular passage, an excerpt from the New Negro, is housed in the Norton Anthology for African American Literature. And this is the first edition out of Sarah Mack's stacks. And this particular edition was edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Nellie McKay. This, I have to say, several years ago was a pleasant surprise because I use the Norton Anthology when I'm teaching African American literature, and there were two courses in particular that I used this book for. When I was teaching at Payne College, I used it for the early Black literature course, as well as the Black literature of the 20th century course. And interestingly enough, somewhere around 2013, 2014, we no longer had a bookstore on campus, and I could see this decline in students just purchasing the book that was required for the course. And I think it had a lot to do with not being able to just run into the bookstore and touch the book and pay for it on site. But this ordering on the internet, waiting for it to come, created this kind of time of negotiation. Do I really need this book? How much are we going to use it? And I remember saying to some students in my class, you all need to have this book. My grandmother had this book in her collection, and she wasn't a college student. So to be sure, as English majors, not only should you have this book for the course, but this should be part of the growing of your own personal library. So I was able to use my grandmother as an example in those courses, trying to get students to not negotiate around purchasing the book and keeping the book, not just selling it back or renting the book. And this particular text from her library has two markings. Otherwise, it is in very good condition. The first marking is on the inside blank page, and that is her signature, Sarah A. Mack. And The second marking is the highlighted passage from Elaine Locke's New Negro. Interestingly enough, about this particular passage that she's highlighted here is that certainly, to be sure, it's rooted in 1925 when you see these new artists that are coming forth, that are trying to establish their own ground. And they are saying that we are coming with a kind of newness, and in some regards that we are doing some things differently than the old guard. But I also can't help but think that we could even apply this to our own moment today, when I have to believe that there must be some kind of imperative for the youth to say, we are carving out a space to be our own just authentic selves, and not necessarily to discard the elders and the ancestors, but certainly to be able to kind of stand on a firm ground that they have had a hand in crafting for themselves. So in that regard, I think that this is not only timely for 1925, but maybe a more timeless passage. This text is something that I think would be a great addition to people's libraries if you enjoy African American literature. I know for my students, it allowed them to experience a buffet, if you will, of poetry and songs, short stories, and excerpts from longer pieces of fiction. When I was teaching the course, the African American literature courses at Payne College, by that time the second edition had come out, and that second edition is actually in my office, and I haven't been in my office. Well, I've actually been back to my office once since the stay-at-home campaign. But I do have here the third edition, and the third edition comes out in 2 different volumes. So you see here, this is volume 1, this is volume 2, and I don't particularly teach these 2 separate volumes. There's something about the way that I teach African American literature. It's not necessarily a natural break for me, the way that the 2 volumes are separated, but I think that there are some things that I do like about the third edition, that I like that they kept the narrative of Venture Smith in the third edition, which doesn't actually appear in the first edition. And the reason why I like the narrative of Venture Smith is because I like to expose students to those narratives where you have a person who has that memory of being free in Africa and growing up, and certain rituals and social organizations around family and community. And then they go through the enslavement process and come out on the other side to something of a condition that is labeled free, but not as free as what once was. And also you get a chance to see them trying to craft a kind of freedom based on those earlier memories. in Africa. Nevertheless, if the second edition was not available, I would recommend the first edition. And that's because these two, I'm not sure if it's the influence of Nellie McKay or maybe just the idea of when the third edition comes out, trying to add a newness to it. But I like the biographical sketches that precede the literary passages in this one. I also like the idea, especially being someone that teaches at an HBCU, I always have to be mindful of students who want to have the text, but maybe the 2 volumes may be a little cost prohibitive, and we certainly can get the job done with the 1 volume. Let me say that what I typically do is have students experience a number of writers and titles that they should be familiar with, using the anthology, and certainly taking some time to look at longer pieces of literature. So I might assign 2 or 3 novels in addition to the anthology so that they get a chance to get exposed to a number of genres and writers and titles, but then also to really experience the worlds of communities and the worlds that are created by authors in the longer form. So with that said, I just wanted to share today this particular selection from Sarah Mack's stacks, the Norton Anthology for African American Literature. This was, again, a pleasant surprise because this is something that I can see that my grandmother and I had in common, not just the love of African American history and culture, but of the literature that is produced in that history and out of that culture. Thanks for listening.